with the club on how to document those finds and how to really become a citizen scientist and how to recognize the species to see which one you can eat or not. But just if there's anything you can take home from this beginning of the talk is that what you see is important. So get out there and see them and document them and never feel that it's an irrelevant coincidence with a mushroom. Sometimes you can only see these species for one day and not even every year. So every coincidence is magic. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see.
And while she's sharing her screen, if you have questions, send it through the chat and we'll read them to her.
Yeah, you can interrupt me as you please. Let me see if oh, sorry, I went, okay. So this is a talk that we're going to make light. There's nothing very dense or too scientific. And if there is, please ask away. So I'm going to talk a bit about women in mycology, which is a big issue for us. So in my case, I'm the first female mycologist in my country. And so it's a topic that's especially dear to me to be able to talk about, because it's not that I'm the first woman, for example, who's ever worked with fungi, but maybe, you know, as with other women, I'm the first female in my country that's been acknowledged with that work. In other countries, many women have worked and their acknowledgement has been given to males who were maybe heads of the laboratory. So it's important to say the names of the women who have made a difference, who paved the way for people like myself to be able to work in mycology. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about why has it been so difficult for women in mycology, and it really goes back to at least the 14th century in Europe, when for the first time in Occidental, so in Western history, the act of healing, so healers and maybe traditional people who were trained in traditional medicine were sort of outcast when a new official sort of professional system was imposed, which has a lot to do with the church impulsing a uniform way of studying healing, which we now call medicine. But really there was a big break in between the traditional healing techniques that were passed down from generation to generation, using plants, animals, and fungi that were in the surrounding environment to treat ailments, either physical or spiritual. And when in the 14th century, when there was a push to professionalize this healing system, and to uniform knowledge and uniform treatments wherever you may be, this traditional healing knowledge was catalogued as pagan. So it was witchcraft, it was paganism, it was hexes. They were, you know, if you were treating with plants that were considered toxic. And ultimately, the practice of traditional healing or traditional medicine was deemed illegal. It was the people, and mostly, but although both men and women were practicing healers and were the inheritors of this knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation, they were punished either by being banished from where they lived, or even in many cases, and in most cases, they were killed. So the punishment for practicing these traditional healing systems passed on from generation to generation with species of fungi, plants, and animals from your environment was a crime and was considered worthy of you being killed for even trying to do that. So this went on for a very long time. It really, really, as far as we can maybe suspect, it signified the loss of a huge amount of knowledge that had been polished from generation to generation for certain territories. It was such a big crime to be involved with fungi, and especially through this healing process, that it was enough to be killed was, for example, to have a twig near your home or outside your home that had this fungus that you see on the screen called tremella growing on it. The common name of tremella is witch's butter. And so if witch's butter was growing outside your home, you must be a witch, either man or woman, and you were killed. And these really massacres signified the death of hundreds of people, of men and women, and even thousands of men and women who were the holders of this traditional wisdom, mushroom wisdom that was passed on. And as I said before, a lot of this knowledge was most probably undocumented and was lost forever with the passing of the people that were the custodians of this knowledge. In European folklore, mushrooms were painted as evil. They were associated with misfortune, with mischief. They were, and in many cases still are, associated with, poisonous toads or poisonous frogs, why we call them toadstools in many cases, or associated to death because they rot. And in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, the process of rotting wasn't really looked upon as the process of recycling energy like we know now. So when something's rotting, it's really decomposing, but the reason to decompose is to be able to recompose. So we know through fungi that that decomposition, or what some people call death, really doesn't exist, because energy isn't lost, energy is transformed. And it's the fungi along with bacteria that transform energy, that recycle organic matter, and that decompose to recompose. And this view of fungi being associated to death, and rot being associated to death, and fungi being associated to hexes or to witches, was really, really big in contrast to what was going on in Oriental cultures, where fungi were associated to longevity, to fortune, to so good luck, to immortality, and to really sort of good health. So this is the origin of what mycologists and people who love fungi know as mycophobia or mycophilia. When we say myco, we're referring to fungi. And there are countries and cultures that are mycophobic. So for example, that have a phobia with fungi, like Great Britain is an example of a country that's known to be mycophobic. And countries that are mycophilic, for example, in contrast, like staying in Europe, for example, like Italy, where fungi are considered, the maximum gourmet, sources of flavor during fall and spring. And a lot of this, a lot of the association between fungi and mushrooms and witches, and this paganist view of a culture or of oral history or of healing, is due to the intoxication of many, many people at the same time by ergot, which is a fungus that infects rye or wheat, and that then the grains are then milled and bread is made, and a whole town would be buying bread from from the local bread maker who had used this infected grain to make flour and then to make bread. But what we know now is that in this species that's called Claviceps purpurea or ergot, and it's that black, sort of that black, tongue coming out of the grain. We know now, for example, that this is where LSD comes from. So lysergic acid was synthesized from this species, from Claviceps purpurea, and unless LSD is synthesized, the symptom, the effect is very different when you're eating this, natural source of lysergic acid, because there are different compounds that grow in the specimen, in the species of fungus that's infecting the rye. And when you eat ergot, or when you eat bread made with flour that was milled from grains that had this this fungus, you get a series of symptoms that maybe some of you will recognize from fairy tales. So your hands will cramp, you get warts on different parts of your body, you get hallucinations, and you're rambling about things that aren't really there. In extreme cases of intoxication from ergot, your limbs, so your nose, your ears, your fingers, can get gangrene and they start falling off. So really, when we think about a person with cramped hands, with warts and maybe with a blacking and falling off nose and rambling and hallucinating, a lot of people associated this with witches and with hexes. And really, if we keep on looking until today, the depiction of a witch is normally of a woman or even a man that have these characteristics that are traced back to intoxication from ergot. And when that happened, when entire towns were eating bread that was made from flour milled with ergot, and because they were labeled as witches, there were massacres. There were massacres of hundreds of women, not only in Europe, but also, for example, in Salem, the witch hunts. There's documentation that traces the witch hunts in the US also to mass intoxication of ergot, with ergot, through bread. So there is, let's say, there is a binding fungus between the symptoms of what we commonly, what we were taught is a witch and a fungus. But of course, ergot doesn't really give you that much power, it seems. I don't know, maybe others have experience. As I mentioned before, fungi were used also not only for healing physical ailments, but also spiritual or emotional ailments. And as the rise of Christianity began, this knowledge was associated to witchcraft. And the women, it was mostly women who were passed on this knowledge from their mothers or grandmothers. They were associated to paganism and to witchcraft, and they were considered a danger and a threat to society, and murdered too. So there was an extermination of the traditional mushroom healing knowledge throughout Europe for at least 3 centuries, and that moved on with Europeans who colonized in different countries. So And as I mentioned before, this really does rival the importance of fungi and how positive and how blessed you are to live among fungi in Chinese folklore, for example, or in Asian cultures, where, for example, reishi, so the fungus we're seeing, this Ganoderma we're seeing on the screen, is the mushroom of immortality or longevity. And it's a very important ingredient in traditional Chinese medicine. So it's a symbol of health, not a symbol of. And I don't know if many of you know, but Beatrix Potter, who is the author who wrote The Tales of Peter Rabbit, for example, a British writer who lived at the end of the 19th century and moving in towards the mid 20th century. She was a very, very curious lichenologist. Beatrix Potter lived in Scotland during the summers, in England during the rest of the year. And one of her preferred activities was going out to look at lichens and look at fungi. And because she wasn't allowed to practice science, because it wasn't something that females did when she was young, she was never able to fulfill her passion of being a mycologist. But she did, however, draw different lichens and fungi, and she has, and it was very recently actually unveiled, this large collection of drawings and of taxonomical notes, so species notes made by Beatrix Potter on the fungi and lichens that she would find during her summers. Ooh, let me see if I can move this. Okay, here are some of her drawings. So wax caps and flamulinas, and so enoki species and wax caps, and not all edible, but really just what she saw. Another very important woman in not only in mycology, but in science at large, is a lady named Fanny Hess. Now, what Fanny discovered was groundbreaking. She was never acknowledged with the finding of, I'll explain what this is now, but it's an agar, we call it. And it was her professor, Robert Koch, who was known as the father of microbiology, who was attributed with discovering this gel. So it's a gelling agent that's found in red algae. And red algae aren't plants, they're members of another kingdom called the protists. So the red algae that you see, you know, in the beach, in the intertidal zone of the ocean, many of them have this gelling agent inside them that you can sterilize and that you can put in little glass containers. And when that's clean and the gel is, you know, is formed, you can cultivate almost, you know, any fungus on it. You can cultivate bacteria on it. You can even cultivate some animals on it. So what Fanny Hess discovered was really the first stone of a whole new era that has allowed us to cultivate fungi. So when people say, oh, you know, to cultivate oyster mushrooms, we buy spawn. So what we buy is basically, let's say, rice or wheat grains that have this one fungus on them, and we buy it pre-made. But what the person who made that spawn has done is, from spores of the mushroom on this gel, on the agar, they have managed to get the spores to germinate, and they've managed to isolate individuals of fungi on this gel that Fanny discovered. And from that fungus, they transfer it onto the rice that we buy as spawn to be able to cultivate. So really, without Fanny Hess, we wouldn't have this, easy, grain spawn available for us to cultivate our fungi. And so many important scientific discoveries would never have been made if we weren't able to cultivate on this gel that she found. She was never recognized, and as I said before, it was her boss who took the credit for her discovery. Another very important woman in mycology, and probably one of the most important women in mycology, is Johanna Westerdijk. She was a Dutch lady who, among many of discoveries, is responsible for discovering Dutch elm disease, which is a fungal disease which decimates elms. And in the US and in Europe, many of you may have heard of Dutch elm disease, and you wouldn't have heard about it if it weren't for Johanna Westerdijk. She was a very important scientist who not only dedicated her life to studying pathogens of plants, but fungal pathogens of plants, but she also dedicated her life to teaching other female scientists to work in that man's world. She was the first female professor in the Netherlands, and in 1917, imagine. And she then went on to be the first director of a very important fungal biodiversity center called CBS, which is still active and is very important in the world of mycology. And she really did invest a lot in the formation of female scientists. So Johanna Westerdijk has been acknowledged in the Netherlands, and there have been some homages made to her work, but not many know that Dutch elm disease was really discovered by a team of female mycologists led by this revolutionary scientist, first ever female professor in the Netherlands.
Giuliana, this is Sam. Have a question.
Okay.
So I always just assumed that it was Dutch elm disease because it came from the Netherlands, but did it originate there, or where she discovered it, or?
So I don't know. I actually have no idea if the pathogen is native to the Netherlands, but I doubt it. Dutch elm disease really has, I think it's one lineage that's all over. It sort of co-evolved with the tree. So I would dare insinuate that the pathogen is probably from the same place as the elm. And I don't know where elms are from, so
Thank you.
have to find out. We'll find that out. It's gonna be on my mind now until I find out. And one of the most important females in mycology, really worldwide, is Miss Elsie Maud Wakefield. She was the head of mycology at Kew Gardens, at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew in England, for 40 years. There's not even a laboratory named after her there. All the laboratories in Kew, almost all of them are named after male scientists. And so I think this might be a good, I might even start a petition to get Miss Elsie Wakefield something named after her there at Kew. She not only discovered, for example, she described psilocybe cyanescens, for example, from a collection made at Kew in the gardens, but she really was the woman who discovered that mushrooms have thousands, tens of thousands of mating types, and that there's not only one way of having sex for mushrooms. Mushrooms can have sex in thousands of ways, and probably the most gender diverse mushroom that we know of is one called Schizophyllum commune. And I'm sure that when you go out, Sam and Cornelia will be able to show you the Schizophyllum, which is a very common mushroom called the split gill fungus or split gill mushroom. You'll find it It's very beautiful. But so Miss Elsie Maud Wakefield studied the fundamentals of how this happened, and for many years she would work on agar plates, with this gelling agent that was discovered by Fanny Hess, crossing different mating types and seeing how recombination of, so how sexual recombination of features could take place in a mushroom. So she's very, very important. But the struggle before the year 1900, the biggest struggle wasn't just to be acknowledged for what you had discovered, but it was really to be able to study. Most women weren't allowed even to go to school, let alone go maybe to senior school or go to university or even grad studies. That wasn't something that was allowed. So really, universities were restricted to male students in most of the Western countries, and it was only until the second half of the 19th century that things started to open up to women. And before the year 1900, only 12 women had published a new type of fungus, so a new taxon, a new name. So, for example, Amanita is a genus, and there are thousands of genera, thousands of types of fungi, but until the year 1900, almost all of them were described and named by men. Only 12 women. But things started to change in the year 1900. And here's a photo, it's not a photo actually, it's a painting of Katerina Helena Dorian, who was a very famous botanist. But she was the first woman to ever name a fungus. So she was the first woman to describe a new group of fungi and was allowed to put her name on it, for the recognition. So before the year 1900, only 43 women who had published any sort of scientific literature on fungi were acknowledged. And of those 43 women, at least 12 were entirely educated at home. So they'd never even left home to go to school. 2 of those women had been at a secondary school as a boarding school. And that was their highest level of education. Of those 43 women who had published any scientific literature on fungi, 6 had gone to university. They didn't get to do a degree, but they had attended some classes. And 21 of these 43 women, so almost half, had degrees from universities, and 15 of them had grad studies. So we're really looking at small numbers here, so we can count them and we can even trace back, where they had studied and how they had studied. But what really strikes me about these numbers is that although the old world was known as Europe, and we're not going to really talk about Asia because there's a big disconnect between what we know was happening in Asia and what we don't know. So really in the Western world, we know very little about what was happening in this time period in Asia. But in the old world, in Europe, doors were very closed for women to study. But it's curious that in the New World and in the Americas is really where we see the biggest development of female mycologists. And so I wanted to point out these numbers, that the most well-attended universities by these 43 women who had published something on fungi before the year 1900, most of them were graduates of the University of Michigan, Cornell, and of the other 18 institutions, 15 of them were in the US. So what we're seeing is that the USA is really sort of a cradle of opportunities to study in university for females interested in fungi. The higher degrees, so graduate studies, were also obtained mostly from North American universities. So there were 9 institutions from which these grad certificates were obtained: Cornell, Michigan, Purdue, and then in Switzerland, Bern, Geneva, and Zurich. But really, I think it's striking that although, so it seems maybe one can even fantasize that many of the people that were leaving England or, the old world, and that were migrating to the new world, to the Americas, really gave their families and gave their communities the opportunity to study. And maybe it was, some sort of rebound characteristic from what they had been living all their lives in Europe. But it's very striking. And today what we see is that there's a much larger number of females involved in mycology. And in the Mycological Society of America, which is really the Mycological Society of North America, we're seeing now for the last 10 years or so that it's been mostly women as presidents and or vice presidents of the institution. And you're all very lucky to live near Julia Kerrigan, for example, from the South Carolina Mushroom Club, SCUMS, who has just been named as vice president of the Mycological Society of America, which means that next she will be president. So there's been always been a big push, a bigger push, let's say, from the North American fungi people in science to include women. In Latin America, we also see a large ratio of women participating. But as I said before, in my case, in my country, in Chile, it's been my role to open this path of mycology to women. And I want to show you some of the species that I've been finding, and maybe 1 or 2 that I've described, I think are in here, to show you what has driven me as the first female mycologist in Chile to basically be in the forest as much as I can for over 20 years. So let me see what I can show you. These are the references to the information that I've been talking about in this talk. And if anybody's interested in a bit more of the details of how women have participated in mycology, this study by Sarah Morosky and Tom May, called Naming Names, the First Women Taxonomists in Mycology, is very, very good. Highly recommend it. Oh, sorry. So here are some of the fungi we find in Chile. This is a geastrum, so an earth star. This species, although we can't see one of the very important features whole, this is geastrum triplex, and it's found in the US too. It has a collar. Here's a little piece of the collar, broken piece. That's a leaf, but this is a broken piece of the collar. And they're very, very beautiful. They're basically puffballs that are on a, on something that resembles a star. Let me show you something like this. If you can see me, you'll see a little earth star as well. This is a mycena, a very, very tiny mycena, probably about maybe, well, definitely less than 1 centimeter tall, that grows on wood. This is a very special species. The Latin name is Bondarzevia whitecacensis. It's a hard one. Bondarzevia whitecacensis, and it grows only in southern Patagonia. My hand is pretty big, so that there's massive.
No, you need.
It's still going up. I sent you a text. I reminded you.
I know.
David, okay. David's muted. Okay. And this, it's not edible. It's very bitter. And when you break it, it exudes a white, bitter latex. But it's extremely common to find either on the base of southern beech, so Nothofagus trees, southern beech, or very high up. Sometimes they, you know, it's happened to me that you're walking through a forest and it's raining and it's the end of fall and a massive, you know, piece of this just boom falls with a twig. Yeah, they can be lethal weapons, I suspect.
It really looks a little like a chicken of the woods.
It does. It looks a lot like a Letiporus, but they're very, very different. This is very thin, and it has sort of pentagonic or hexagonal pores. Not round or oval. And as I mentioned before, the most characteristic feature is that when you break it, it exudes this extremely bitter white latex. Yeah. This is an entomopathogenic fungus. So this is Isaria. Isaria is one of the types of so one name given to some cordyceps species. So this is really an asexual phase of a cordyceps that's growing underneath the pine needles here. There is a pupa of a moth, and these are the asexual spores forming on top, the white parts. And this is probably one of, I'm going to show you a series now of photographs of one of the most spectacular fungi we find here in Patagonia. It's called Sitaria. They are of a group called the ascomycetes. So are morels. Morels are ascomycetes too. This basically means that they are, this fungus is more of a relative to a morel than to a puffball, for example. And this species, the genus name, so the first name of all these that I'm going to show you is Sitaria. And Sitaria only grow on Nothofagus trees on this southern beech. And the thing is that this southern beech was lived on the massive landmass that we call Gondwana that separated hundreds of millions of years ago to give birth to the southern hemisphere. So we know that before the continents were formed, there was one very big landmass that we call Pangaea. Pangaea split into two big landmasses, Laurasia and Gondwana. Laurasia split up and the continental drift gave way to the northern hemisphere where you all are now. And Gondwana, this big landmass south of the equator, split and drifted to give way to the southern hemisphere where I am now. When that happened, the trees that lived on the big landmass called Gondwana split with the continents and drifted with the land masses. And with the trees drifted the fungus. So the Sitaria fungi are only found in Patagonia, so southern Patagonia, Chile and Argentina. We share Patagonia with Chile and Argentina. Tasmania and the southern part of Australia and New Zealand. So, and Papua New Guinea, all of that. So the southern tip of South America, New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, and South Africa were all stuck together when when Gondwana existed, and when the landmass separated, the tree went with them and the fungus went with the tree. So in South America, we have 7 species of Sitaria, and we eat 6 of them. They're very important food for, they're an important traditional food in the cultures, in the indigenous cultures of Patagonia. And in New Zealand and Australia, there are another 3 or 4 species of Sitaria, and that's it. It's the only place in the world where they exist. And people come to Chile and Argentina, mycologists, not any people, but fungus people, especially to see these fungi. They're very, very special because of this biogeographical history they tell. So this one is Sitaria berteroi. And actually, I'm going to go and show you because I have one here. I have a fresh one. Give me 1 second. I have some fresh ones here. Okay. They can be very small. Okay. They can be very small. Well, not very, but they can be small like this, or they can be huge, really huge, like this. See? There's Sitaria berteroi. And if we were seeing it in the same orientation, it would be like that, like on the photograph. And this one, I opened up to see what it looked like on the inside. And what you see here, basically, these are all little cup fungi. And I'll show it when I end the screen sharing so you can see it better. But these really are just structures that hold many, many little cups, just like cup fungi that you find in spring in the US. So that's Sitaria berteroi, a choice edible here. This is Sitadaya Hukurai. We don't eat this one. Well, some people say it's edible, but I know for a fact that it's not edible, and I've eaten it a couple of times and it's been really, really bad. Just no, not edible. This is Sitaria Johowi, Sitaria Johowi, which is very small and hard to find, edible as well. This is Darwin's golf ball, Sitaria darwinii. And what happened was that in 1846, during the voyage of the Beagle, Charles Darwin came to southern Patagonia, and he observed the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego collecting these, he called them esculent excrescences that were growing on the southern beach, and they were eating these during spring and summer. And he collected them and took them back to England. And about 10 years later, the species was described and was given Darwin's name in honor of the person who had discovered them. Although indigenous peoples had been eating them for centuries, the discovery is attributed to Darwin. So Sitaria darwinii, or bread of the Indians, as he called it. And each one of these Sitarias grow on one or more, but different types of this tree of southern beach, different species.
So Giuliana,
yeah.
Someone was asking about the spelling of Sitaria, and then
C-Y-T-T-A-R-I-A. So C-Y-T-T-A-R-I-A, Sitaria.
And then I was curious how they are prepared.
Oh, okay. So they're well, I best like them just fresh off the tree. Oh, look, here are some. I haven't got to the species yet, but I'll show you. So it's next. I think it's next on the slide. So this is another species. I'll show you. Let me see if I can get to them. Here, Sitaria Espinoza. And look at the difference in size here. So Sitaria, so we eat them either just like this, or we'll just eat them raw.
Wow.
Or when you break them, and you'll be able to see this. I don't know if you can see some sort of goo. Do you see the goo? Like the, okay. People love cooking them with eggs, and they go sort of gooey, like really, really gooey. And then there are others like myself who doesn't like that goo. So most people in Chile either cut them fresh and make them in a salad and try to eat them before they go gooey, or they will embrace the gooiness and make them with scrambled eggs. So really it's sort of the two main ways, either with scrambled eggs or in a salad. And then just normally when you go out to harvest them, I would say that most people are just, you know, most of your haul you're eating just off the tree. So yeah.
And I think I remember you saying they are maybe a little bit sweet. Is that
So
right?
one I showed before, this Berteroi is sweet, is the sweetest. This one is the sweetest. And people love it because it's sweet. The others, this one also, the pan de indio, we call it yao yao, is also, you can find some that are sweeter than others. And then the one that's most common and most eaten, which, look here, see there's a little hole here. Let me see if I can show you. I'll show it afterwards without sharing the screen. Is sort of the less tastier one, let's say. But normally in salad or with scrambled eggs. And here is another binatra, so the one I showed you before, the Sitaria berteroi. And it's very common to see it like this, you know, on live trees. They will form a gall, and the fungus comes out of this gall, and normally full of lichens too for this species. Even in the tiny trees, you know, trees that are maybe 30 centimeters tall, you will find abundant numbers of these Sitaria on them. So some people call them parasites. I actually call them obligate biotrophs. So it's a sort of a parasite that doesn't kill the tree. We don't know whether it's giving it any benefit, but they're always together. So they're sort of always, you know, they hang out constantly. And this is Sitaria exigua, which is a species that was never found really in Chile. It was exclusive to Argentina. And this photograph is the first collection in Chile, which I made in Tierra del Fuego, which is this island at the southern tip of South America. And for the new people in the club, don't, as I said before, never underestimate what you see, but also never underestimate what you find when you go and have a pee in the forest, because this is one of those finds. So you know, it's a classic. There are so many. I've found even new species to science, and I've been with people who have found new species to science when they say, I'll be right back, you know, I'm just gonna go and have a pee. And then they come back with this, you know, amazing mushroom, and it turns out to be new. And so this is what happened with this one, which turned out to be new to a new register for Chile. So,
that's great.
Yeah, Sitaria exigua. This is a native brother or sister of the bluet. You know Lepista nuda or Clitocybe nuda. You call them bluets and you eat them in the US. This is Lepista fibrosissima. It's also edible, but it's exclusive to Tierra del Fuego. So here's a family member of the bluets.
So would that, Giuliana, would that technically also be cultivatable, because bluets are cultivatable?
Yes, technically it could. Yeah.
Does that, I wonder about when eating it, if that hairy texture like still comes out through the cooking.
Yeah, and it does. And so what we do is we peel we peel off that cuticle.
It looks a bit like Velcro.
Yes, it does. It feels like Velcro too. They're very, very sturdy, and yeah, they're not soft. hairs. Quite a large mushroom, actually.
Huh.
Yeah. This is Amanita Galactica. This is an Amanita that I found and described a few years ago. Actually, yeah, maybe 6 years ago I found it in a mixed forest of southern beech and monkey puzzle trees, the Araucaria. So it's a very old ecosystem, and working with the, so looking at the DNA of this fungus, we can trace it back to Gondwana as well. So this species was around before the continents drifted apart to give way to the southern hemisphere. That it's an old species, and nobody had ever described it. So when I say what you see matters, this is a good example. I actually saw it from the car because, you know, it gets to a point when you're just so obsessed with mushrooms that you see them from the car. And yeah, it's funny that you really see them even at night from a car. But I was driving through and it was snowing and raining, and I saw these on the edge of the road in the national park and had to stop. And it turned out nobody had if a human had coincided with it, they've never collected it or shown it to anybody else. So because it's pitch black with these white scales on top, and we know it's an Amanita. It looks like an Amanita, like the fly agaric, but it's black, and it looked like a galaxy, so I named it Galactica. Amanita Galactica.
So you got to name this then.
I got to name it. Yeah, I got to name it.
And it almost looks like a black and white photo, except you can see the brownish color.
Exactly, it's pitch black on top, and it's like looking at a starry night.
Yeah.
So I actually called it Amanita Galactica. I saw it and I said, this is Amanita Galactica. And it took a few years to describe it, but now it's formally discovered and named.
Cool.
These are Neoclitorcybees. So these are wood-dwelling fungi, also from Tierra del Fuego. I'm showing you the extreme findings here, very, very far south. And Cortinarius species. So these southern beech trees are ectomycorrhizal. What does that mean? So almost every tree on Earth, if not every tree on Earth, lives with several species of fungi on or in their roots. And these trees can't live without the fungi. Plants can't synthesize nutrients from soil without the help of fungi. And when life evolved from an aquatic environment, from water onto land, plants did that with the help of fungi. And there are many species of trees that associate with fungi that grow mushrooms, that make mushrooms. Not all trees do. Some trees associate with fungi that only live in the roots or on the roots, and the whole cycle is underground and it's microscopic. And they're called endomycorrhizal. So myco, fungus, rhizae, root. So root fungi can be endo, in the root. So fungi in the root, or fungi on the root, ecto, on top. And the ecto, the ones that live on the roots and not in them, produce these mushroom forms, or coral fungi, or even puffballs, or all sorts of shapes and textures. And the southern beech, the Cortinarius, the southern beech, the Nothofagus, associate with hundreds of species of Cortinarius. So I can tell you, just so you can maybe, wrap your head around how many, in a study we did with universities from England and North America, we found in 3 years 200 new species of Cortinarius just on the Nothofagus in southern Patagonia. So 200 new species to science, all of them Cortinarius. And so really what you see matters, because it was just, some can call it luck, some can call it coincidence, some can call it magic. But when you find a mushroom, it doesn't mean anybody else has found it before. Never forget that. This is another Cortinarius, and it's a Cortinarius that we eat. It's called Cortinarius lebre. We call it leure as a common name, and it smells of naphthalene. Cornelia, you're walking through the forest and all you can smell is naphthalene, so mothballs.
So that means mothballs, yeah.
Mothballs. You're
horrible.
smelling mothballs, it's vile.
Ugh.
But when you cook them, the mothball smell comes out with the vapor, and then you're just left with actually quite a tasty fungus. But you have to boil it and throw the water out, maybe a couple of times. Lebre or leure, and it's very sought after in local markets here.
Oh, really?
Can you use it to keep the bugs away?
No, I've tried. I did actually put a couple in my wardrobe once, and no, definitely not. And they decompose with these amazing larvae. You end up with a wardrobe full of maggots.
Counterproductive.
Yeah, not good, not good. But really, it's astonishing when you're walking through the forest that you immediately find it because you smell the mothballs.
Wow.
And very pungent, like you can hardly sit by them. I mean, taking this photo was agony. That's all I can say. It takes a while. And this is another Cortinarius called Cortinarius Magellanicus. And it's one of the most common Cortinarius that we find here in Chile. And it's a beauty in fall. You're just walking through these, shiny purple mushrooms that are so slippery because they have like mucus on them that you can't even pick them up. They just, they sliver out of your hands. They're really, really covered in a translucent goo. Another type of mushroom that we find a lot are of a genus called Austropaxillus. Now you might know Paxillus species, and there are the Paxillus involutus. I don't know if they have a common name. Do you know, Sam and Cornelia, if Paxillus has a common name?
Well, some of them are velvet foot.
Velvet foot.
Yeah, they do have velvet feet.
And they've been changed into the Tapinella.
Right. So the only one. So Tapinella is what was Paxillus panoides, which grows on stumps of pine, and that was carved off into the genus Tapinella. But there still, I think, are a couple of true Paxillus species, and this is Austropaxillus. Now, it doesn't mean that they're relatives of the velvet foot in the northern hemisphere. It's just that the mycologists that described them were from Europe. So they said, oh, this looks like a Paxillus, but it's in the south, so we're going to call it Austropaxillus. And there are many species like that here that are named Austro something, like, because they look like the ones in the northern hemisphere. And these Austropaxillus are also, we're about to publish, there were only 4 species described. And for many years, over 15 years, I could see that there were more than 4 types. They were all different. And North American mycologists from the University of Tennessee and from the University of Florida got an NSF grant from the National Science Fund or Foundation in the US to come and study the fungi that grew on the roots of these trees here in Chile and Argentina. And when we partnered, they partnered with us, and we took them, collecting. And I kept saying, there are more than 4 species. And they were like, no, they're not. They're really well studied. There are 4. And we bet a beer with Matt Smith, Dr. Matt Smith, who's been, I think he's been to has he given a talk at the club?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
And Matt said, if you're right and there are more species, I owe you, I'll get you beers. And it turns out that there are 11 species, and we're describing the 7 that were new. And when I last saw him last year, he bought me more than 1 beer. So I have to say, he's not in debt. But we found 7 new species to science from what, everybody, even the specialists, thought were only 4. So what you see matters. I can't stress that enough. Austropaxillus. This is an Entoloma. Look at this wonderful Entoloma. This species is called Entoloma Necopinatum, and it's actually endangered. So it's been red listed. It's a species that's under threat because the habitat it lives in has been fragmented and broken up. But this is a very curious group of fungi because they have pink spores. So if you see underneath, it's a beautiful, green, striking green. You'll find blue entolomas and, all sorts of beautiful colors. But almost all of them have pink spores. And the spores are square. So when you get to look at them, they're angled. They look square, but they have sharp angles, and they're very beautiful to look at. So every time you find a little mushroom growing on soil that has pink spores, a good bet is that it would be an Entoloma. If it's growing on wood, a good bet would be Pluteus. But if it's on soil and it's pinkish underneath, you can try.
Giuliana, can we ask just like what degree of pinkness, like obviously pink or?
What degree? No, it's a striking pink.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely pink. Pink. It's not a beigey pink.
Okay.
Now, what happens now is that there are a group of these sort of entolomas that have whitish spores, and they've been put into a new genus called Leptonia. And right, so the Leptonias are really entolomas with white spores, but in North America lives and works, the Mr. Entoloma, which is Tim Baroni. Timothy Baroni is one of the most important mycologists in North America, and he published a great book a few years ago, a field guide, I think, to is it northeastern North America or something? Do you know the book?
It's northeastern. This is the southeastern one with Todd, so it looks like this, only it's mushrooms from the northeast.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. So Timothy, and he's like Mr. Entoloma. And I call him Mr. Entoloma, and he's a great dance partner as well in congresses, I have to say. This is a Gymnopolis. Gymnopolis is this species is called Gymnopolis purpuratus, and it's a brother or sister of the laughing gyms of Gymnopolis junonius or Gymnopolis spectabilis, and these have psilocybin in them. So these are psychoactive species of Gymnopolis, and this one is native to Chile. And not the next one that's coming up, there'll be another one soon. This is a very, very special mushroom called Lichenom Falina. This is growing on a salt flat in the Andes, in the Atacama Desert. So this is very, very opposite, extreme environment in the salt flats of the Atacama Desert. Lichenom Falina alto andina. So alto andina, high in the Andes. It's a very beautiful, very small. So here in Chile, as well as eating most of the Sitarias that I was showing you, we eat most of our coralloid fungi, the Ramaria. And they are very important to native peoples, to indigenous peoples. This species in Latin is called Ramaria subaurantiaca, but we call them changle. Changle is the common name, and there is pink changle, yellow changle, whitish changle, but they're all called changle. There's even a purple one. So this is the white, this is Ramaria patagonica. We call it the white changle. This is the common changle, the yellow one. This is, we call it Ramaria flava, but we now think it's not flava, which is described for Europe. And so we need to study this whole group. And this is Ramaria botrytis, which you probably have too. And we just call it the purple changle. And we eat all of these. And there's only one that we don't eat. And we don't eat it because it's bitter, not because it's poisonous or anything. This is a new species of Ramaria that I found maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I still haven't described. So I have to find a name for it. And yeah, we haven't been able to find anything like it. And we know from the DNA that it hasn't been found anywhere else before. So,
Giuliana, do your Ramaria, do they grow, you know, some coral species grow on wood, some grow from the soil?
right. So, so the ones that grow on wood are now, they're no longer called Ramarias, and they've been moved into a genus called Artomyces. And so the true Ramarias are ectomycorrhizal. They live on the roots of trees. So you'll find them growing on soil. But before we would, so we used to call the coral fungi that grew on wood Ramaria, but not anymore. Now they're Artomyces, most of them. And there are some other genus names too. So that's a new one. And this one used to be called, and this is a good example. This is the bitter one. It used to be called Ramaria flaccida, but as you see here, it's growing on wood, and it's not. We can't call it Ramaria anymore. It's not a family. It's member. It's not related to Ramaria, but this is another genus called Phaeoclavulina. Phaeoclavulina, and so it's not even an Artomyces. It's a wood-dwelling coralloid fungus in its own genus, Phaeoclavulina. We don't eat it because it's bitter. This is one that looks a bit like your honey mushrooms, and this is an Armillaria. Oh no, sorry, not honey. Oh, your like your Hypholoma. I'm sorry, it's late here. The Hypholoma. So I don't know what you call the Hypholoma fasciculare. It's a very common fungus. Does it have a common name? Greenish gills on wood in big clusters. Hypholoma fasciculare. Sorry?
We're thinking here.
Okay, so the Hyphalomas, which are really abundant, and this is a native Hypholoma called Hypholoma australe, and found here in Patagonia only. This is another Hypholoma, Hypholoma brunea. They always grow on wood, and they have one very, very cool feature. You can test at the club when you find Hypholoma fasciculare, and it's that they're fluorescent with UV light.
Ah, so it was the sulfur tuft. That's what we
Sulfur cap.
And there's also the brick cap.
Right, the brick cap is probably Hypholoma fasciculare. And they have pale greenish gills when they're mature, but the spore print isn't green. And one interesting thing to do is to get these UV lights and just try them in the dark, light it, and they fluoresce green. They're not bioluminescent, they are fluorescent. So they don't emit their own light, but they do reflect fluorescently. This is a wondrous, wonderful,
Wow.
stinky stinkhorn. And this is Iliodiction. Iliodiction is a genus, and this is tiny. I mean, it's not taller than 3 or 4 centimeters. So that's, freshly cut grass, very small. And they are, these stinkhorns are really just have evolved in an incredible way, because what you see there, that brown gooey stuff, which sometimes is greenish, is a spore mass. So the spores, which are sort of similar to seeds in plants, are in that mass. So the strategy that this fungus has evolved is that mass smells like rotten meat. And that's why they're called stink horns, because they really do stink. I mean, you wouldn't walk behind somebody carrying that. You just, it's really stinky. It stinks of rotten meat to attract flies, and the flies get covered in the spores, and then they move around and they collect spores and disperse the spores that they're loaded with from thinking that that's rotten meat. So really spectacular. Also in the desert, so Chile is home to the driest desert on earth. It's called the Atacama Desert. It's the place with the less continued rainfall, like in history. Not only Death Valley in California, which is registered, I think, in 1 year as the driest place, but this is the driest desert. But there are fungi in the Atacama Desert, and it's incredible. They grow, they're like puffballs, many of them. This is a species called Podaxis pistillaris. And the spores that are inside these brown mass inside, the spores of almost all these species that grow in the desert are used as medicinal to scar wounds. So there's a species in we call it the lower part of the desert, where there's still some plants. This is a very beautiful cosmopolitan fungus called Sauerbiello renana. It discovered in Germany, but also found in the US. It can form fairy rings because it's also a fungus that lives on roots of trees. It's an ectomycorrhizal fungus that's a family member of the Sitaria and the morels. So it's an ascomycete. It's not very related to mushrooms as we, with gills like shiitake or oysters. Here's another Cortinarius. So Cortinarius can sometimes have slimy caps and dry stipes, or sometimes slimy caps and slimy stipes. Sometimes just a slimy stipe and a dry cap, or they can be dry. And they used to be classified in groups because of how slimy they were or where the slime was. Today, you can still use that character more or less to separate groups, but DNA has changed a bit how we establish relationships. And here is a very small Gymnopolis. This is called Gymnopolis Austropicrius. And it's a relative of the laughing gyms, but it's very small, about 1.5 centimeters tall. And coming near the end, there's still some more. This is a Stropharia. So I just really like the picture because of the raindrop. Stropharia, which is some sort of a relative of Psilocybees. Here is the other Gymnopolis I mentioned, Gymnopolis chilensis, that also has psilocybin in it, and it's a native to Chile. Gymnopolis chilensis, related to laughing gyms. Now here's a very special group of fungi. The genus we now know is, the name is Geomorium. It used to be called Underwoodia. And this one I found on the same day, and actually very close to the Amanita Galactica that I described, the black Amanita. Remember I told you that it was snowing? Well, it was really cold. It's called commonly the earth tooth because it looks a lot like a tooth. And there are different species. There's even one truffle Geomorium that grows under the soil. And there is a species of Geomorium that colleagues named after me. So there's a Giuliana Furci for my surname, which is probably one of the biggest honors I've ever had. And it's funny because the Geomorium that was named after myself looks like a turd. And they said to me that they had named it after me because I'm always looking in dung. And not only does it look like dung, that it also is a group, its DNA is different to the others, and it's alone on a lineage by itself. So it's sort of doing its own thing in evolution, and it looks like poo. So that's Geomorium Furci, named after me because it looks like dung. There you go. The funny story there.
Oh my.
And yeah, and this is another pea discovery. So this is a new species of Cortinarius that I got to name as well. I called it Cortinarius chlorosplendidus. So chloro is green, so splendid green. And I found this just going behind a log to have a pea in the forest. So really what you see matters, and never underestimate, what you find when you're taking a restroom break in the forest. Cortinarius chlorosplendidus, new species. It's a pea find. And this is used to be called Pleuratopsis, now called Citinotus longiquus. Citinotus. I liked Pleuratopsis more. It looks a bit like a Pleurotus, but now it's called Citinotus. And that's also from Tierra del Fuego. Now, here in the Southern Hemisphere and in Chile and Argentina, we have two species of beefsteak fungus, which many of you might know, called Fistulina hepatica, where in the Northern Hemisphere, so in the US. The beefsteak fungus you can eat raw. It looks a bit like a piece of steak, but it also looks like a liver. That's why it's called hepatica, Fistulina hepatica. This is a native endemic species to Chile called Fistulina endoxantha. And we also eat it, but it's yellow, as you see, not bright red.
It's the fatty liver.
No, it's the chicken steak.
Beefsteak fungus?
No, I'm just joking because it's yellow. And
Oh,
then,
well.
And I
then,
was making a joke about fatty liver.
and Michaela
Oh,
was joking because
see?
so we're both doctors, and we know that when livers are really unhealthy and full of fat cells, they look like that actually. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah, there it is. There's the fatty liver beef. Yeah. Fistulina endoxantha.
Oh,
Here's
wow.
a Geoglossum. Geoglossum is a earth. Oh, what are they called? Earth tongue.
Earth tongues.
Earth tongues. Yeah, that one was very tiny. They're also ectomycorrhizal. They live on roots of trees. And here, well, look, there's the endoxantha. See, there's the fatty liver. And this is a pleuroflammula, we call it, pleuroflammulina. And it's a species native to Chile and to Argentina. And there's a little patch, it was actually for reference to size, but the web page is on it. This is a native Lepiota species. So Lepiotas are found many places of the world. This one is called Lepiota trongolei, and it was described by Rolf Singer, who is a very important mycologist, a German gentleman who had discovered fungi all over the world, but a lot in Venezuela. He was in Brazil, he was in Chile, in Argentina. Just very prolific person, mycologist, describing species. And this is a truffle species. So this is called, this is a species called Hallingia purpurea, and it's called Hallingia after Roy Holling, who is a North American mycologist who specializes on boletes.
That's very cool.
So this is a genus named after Roy Holling. Halingia purpurea, and it was described by Mike Castellano, a North American truffle mycologist from Oregon. And I think he was in the National Forest Service for most of his working life, Paul Castellano.
Yes.
And he described that here. Now, it's interesting that this truffle looks a lot like a seed, which is right here. The ones that are out of focus here and on the sides are a seed of a myrtaceous tree. And what we're now discovering is that there are native birds who eat the berries and the fungus. And they look very similar on the forest floor, and the same bird eats both of them. And so this species is dispersed by birds who probably confuse it for the berry or vice
So
versa.
would that be like fungi mimicry?
Yeah, or it's fungi mimicry, or as I love to think, it's just the plant mimicking the fungus. It's the seed that looks like the truffle. This is another, this is a flammula, subflammans is the, so Epholoma is a hypholoma subflammans. Sorry, yeah, it's also relative of the brick cap. And this is one of the most beautiful species in Chile. This is called Stephanopus azureus or azuria, Stephanopus azureus, and it's a relative of the Cortinarius. It will probably be, the name will probably be changed to Cortinarius, unfortunately, although Stephanopus sounds so much better. It has the same cinnamon spores as the Cortinarius, and it's in the same family as Cortinarius. Now, this is a very special formation here. The fungus is a so it's the only species in the group. It's called Ostrobasidium peweldeni, because and it's funny, but what you're seeing isn't the fungus. This is atrophied plant tissue. So the fungus makes the plant grow out these sort of, tongues that are sort of pinky gray, and the fungus is living inside that tissue, but it's actually plant tissue that's been malformed by the fungus. Austrobasidium peweldeni, one species in the genus. So there are no other Austrobasidiums in the world, only Austrobasidium peweldeni.
So it's kind of like a reverse lichen in a way. It's taking the
Yeah,
plant
it is.
and protecting itself.
Yeah, it is. And this is, we were talking about the fatty liver, the beefsteak fungus. So here in Chile, we don't have Fistulina hepatica. This is Fistulina antarctica. So we have the species, the yellow one, Endoxantha, and this one is Fistulina antarctica, and it grows really just in Patagonia on these nothofagus trees. And it's edible too, but it's a lot smaller, I'd say, than the hepatica one. Another Cortinarius, just so that you can see some of the diversity. This one is, I can't remember the name actually of this one. Something to do with the bulb. It will come to me. And that's the end of my slideshow.
Oh, yes.